Hello, welcome to the Polyglot Files. My name is Michael, and today we're talking about the oldest language in the world. Again. If you've ever seen my videos or my shorts here on YouTube, then you know that the oldest language in the world is a topic that I've covered many times before, especially in relation to one language in particular. I'm looking at you, Tamil. So today we're talking about a language that I often see come up whenever we have conversations about this topic. Namely, I want to know, is Sanskrit the oldest language in the world? First things first, Sanskrit is an Indo-Aryan language that is part of the larger Indo-European language family. This means that it is closely related to languages like Gujarati, Hindi, and Persian, but it is also more distantly related to languages like Greek, Armenian, and even English. In fact, dozens of words in English have descended directly from the Sanskrit language. This includes words such as avatar, cheetah, karma, guru, and yoga. Today, Sanskrit is a language that is almost completely extinct. I say almost completely because even though Sanskrit was effectively not a spoken language after 600 AD, there are still apparently some native speakers scattered throughout the world. Sanskrit was first spoken as a language in the Indus Valley around 2000 BC. Its first speakers were actually semi-nomadic peoples who arrived in the Indus Valley from the Pontic-Caspian steppe. This gave rise to what is known as Vedic Sanskrit. Vedic Sanskrit is the language that was used in religious texts such as the Rig Veda. Sanskrit was first standardized by a man named Pangini in 400 BC, and this gave rise to Classical Sanskrit, a language that would be used in literature and in learning for the next 1,000 years. This is also when colloquial dialects of the Sanskrit language, called Prakrits, began to develop. One of these Prakrits was called Hindi, and it coexisted with Sanskrit for many years. By 600 AD, however, Hindi surpassed classical Sanskrit in everyday use. Sanskrit then became a language that was confined to religious texts and literature, and even today, only about 14,000 people claim to speak Sanskrit as their native language. In order to determine if Sanskrit is the oldest language in the world, we first need to figure out just how old Sanskrit is exactly. Dating the earliest use of Sanskrit, however, is pretty tricky, and that's because Vedic Sanskrit was a language based on oral tradition. This means that Vedic Sanskrit wasn't necessarily written down. It was rather passed generation to generation through the memorization of stories and hymns. In fact, the earliest surviving Sanskrit inscription is the Ayodhya inscription written in Brahmi script that dates back to 100 BC, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Sanskrit wasn't spoken before that date. Most linguists actually believe that the language first emerged in the Indus Valley in 1500 BC, and that would make Sanskrit about 3,500 years old. So while it is evident that Sanskrit is an old language, does that mean that it is the oldest language in the world? Well, not really. This is because there are other languages that can be proven to date back to earlier than 1500 BC, and they have written records to prove it, unlike Sanskrit. For example, Sumerian has written records that date back to 3000 BC. Akkadian, spoken in the same area as Sumerian, has written records dating back to 2500 BC. Further, some historians argue that the earliest Egyptian hieroglyphs date back to 3300 BC. Based on these written records, as well as the generally accepted academic timelines for when these languages were spoken, we can pretty much say that Sanskrit is not the oldest language in the world in this context. However, written records can be destroyed and scientists can be mistaken. So is there perhaps another way that Sanskrit is the oldest language in the world? One of the biggest arguments for why Sanskrit is the oldest language in the world is because of its similarities with other languages. In fact, Sanskrit has a large number of words that have a striking similarity to English and other Indo-European languages. This includes words such as mother, father, son, daughter, and cow. In fact, when Europeans first began studying the Sanskrit language, they thought to themselves, wow, these English words must have descended from Sanskrit, and thus Sanskrit is the original oldest language from which all other languages evolved. Yeah, that isn't exactly the truth, however. While it is tempting to think that all of these words descended into languages like English from Sanskrit, the reality is a little bit more complicated, and it has to do with human migration. As mentioned earlier in this video, Sanskrit evolved out of an earlier Indo-Aryan language spoken in the Indus Valley that arrived from the Pontic-Caspian steppe. In addition to the Indo-Aryans who lived on the Pontic-Caspian steppe, other Indo-European peoples also migrated from that spot across Asia and Europe. Because of this, linguists believe that the Pontic-Caspian steppe was the homeland of the Indo-Europeans and thus all Indo-European languages, English and Sanskrit included. Rather than the English words such as mother, father, son, daughter, and cow having evolved out of Sanskrit, these words in both English and Sanskrit evolved out of their parent language in the Pontic-Caspian steppe. That language was Proto-Indo-European. This accounts for why all these languages have such similar words and for why academics originally thought that English could have evolved out of Sanskrit. There will come a day when I cease to talk about Tamil on this channel, but today is not that day. Let's answer one question in particular. Is Tamil older than Sanskrit? Or is Sanskrit older than Tamil? Drum roll, please! Linguists believe that they're relatively the same age. The first written records of Tamil date back to 580 BC, and yes, those are older than the first written samples of Sanskrit, which date back to 100 BC. However, linguists believe that Sanskrit was first spoken around 1500 BC without being written down, and this is also the time frame in which they believe that Tamil was first spoken. Because of this, it is impossible to tell which language was spoken first, Tamil or Sanskrit, but it is generally believed that they first emerged around the same time, and they continued to influence each other throughout their histories. In conclusion, Sanskrit is an old language, but is it the oldest language in the world? The short answer is no. Depending on how you define the oldest language in the world, Sanskrit does not have the oldest written record, nor do linguists believe that it was the oldest oral language. Not to mention, and I've stated this before in other videos on this topic, it is impossible for us to know what the oldest language in the world is, namely because we weren't there when language first started being used 200,000 years ago by human beings, and we don't have a time machine to go back and determine which one it was. Not to mention, all languages developed through language evolution, and that means that all languages spoken today are in fact descendants of some older language, and thus all languages spoken today are the oldest languages spoken on Earth because they didn't just come to us from outer space. They evolved from a parent language that evolved from a parent language, and so on and so forth to the beginning of human history. Either way, we can pretty much say that the Sanskrit used today is probably not the same Sanskrit that developed from Indo-Aryan, therefore Sanskrit is not the oldest language in the world. But neither is Tamil, so don't get excited. Is this debate settled? Is there something I'm missing? I'm sure you have 1,000 thoughts, so leave them in the comments below. You can also follow me on social media. I have a Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok account. As usual, thank you for watching the Polyglot Files, and I will see you next time. Goodbye!